morning. I'm Denise Linn. I'm an elder at Westminster. Have been a member here for a dozen or so years. I'm a member of the choir, but I'm also chair of the Benevolence Committee this year. It's been a great experience to be a part of Benevolence. We have a rich history at Westminster for giving, and I'm so glad to have a wonderful committee that is working hard this year to further that commitment and that tradition at Westminster. I have some friends and familiar faces here who together we can tell you about benevolence at Westminster, and these gentlemen have been strong supporters of benevolence, committed members of the committee, and chairs in the past. So let's get started, if you don't mind. Walker, do you want to start?
Thank you. I'm Walker Choppin. I've been a member since the 70s. I'm an elder. I first got involved with Benevolence Committee in the 2010 period. And back then, you know, we had a list of benevolences that the church had supported. And our job was to make sure these agencies that receive the funds were still operating well, and we understood their mission. And the agencies were some very large and had been recipients of our funds for many, many years. And other agencies were quite small, and we looked at all of them. And a lot of the work was really just to review them and to make sure the funds were being spent properly. We did, over time, want to expand the benevolences if we could, to try and see other agencies in Nashville, and also to make sure that members of Westminster were involved in these agencies too. So it was more of we were supporting your agency and you're a member of the church, that type of thing. So we worked on that program for a while. One of the great benefits of being on the Benevolence Committee were the times that we were able to have our regular meetings at an agency location. That way we were able to interact with the staff there often and get a real feel for what the agency did. It was very meaningful to us. It's one thing to look at reports and summaries and this type of thing, but it's a lot better to get involved with the agency and see it on site. We often didn't interact with the patients or beneficiaries of the services because of confidentiality, and also it was after hours often. And those kind of meetings were difficult to schedule because of everyone's calendar and things, and it was often in a different location, that type of thing. It was very worthwhile, and the more of that that we can do, I think would be great for the Benevolence Committee and its members.
I'm Scott Portis, and I've been a member of the church for about 25 years. I was on the Benevolence Committee from 2013 to 2018, and joined at a time when there was a good process in place that we were following to evaluate the different agencies, and that process had been in place for quite a while. After going through and being a new member of the committee and going and reviewing the agencies and following the process that we were doing, we visited in 2015 with a representative from the Scarlet Family Foundation, and we were already kind of thinking about the process and could we improve it. And that gentleman met, there were 3 or 4 of us from the committee that went, and he gave us a bunch of the criteria that they used when they evaluated how they would give money, and they're on a much larger scale, obviously. So that gave us sort of a starting point to start thinking, could we make the process a little different, a little better than it was? And so Mark Dunkerley and I volunteered to take that project on, and that was in 2016. So we worked throughout 2016 on the process, and went through several revisions and reviewed it with the committee and all those things, and came up with a process that did a few things. One, it created sort of a metric measurement of each of the organizations that we were looking at. And the goal wasn't to, if an organization had a low score, it didn't mean that they were automatically going to be excluded. It was just a way to take out this sort of institutional bias which comes in when often when you don't have any other thing to give to somebody other than you like them and you've always given to them. And we felt like that we had done that a lot, and we didn't have any other criteria upon which to base our decision making for $500,000, $300,000 to $500,000 that we were giving away every year. And so we wanted to do the best that we could to do the best for the organizations, and that's the end goal, right? Is to make sure that the organizations are healthy and thrive and grow and can continue their outreach. So ultimately, we came up with a process that helped us look at both the leadership, the purpose, and the financial metrics of the organization and take all those into a whole and create a view of each applicant that was applying for funds that year and compare them all to each other. And then we looked at things like how core or how much did the mission of that organization mesh with the church's goals and interests and focus, so that the committee had a better chance of funding, in some cases, fewer organizations with more money than feeling like we had to spread out the money to everybody who applied. It gave us some standing to say, let's not fund this organization. Either they don't fit our mission, they're not very well organized, and they don't seem like they're using the money well, or they're so strong that our 0.1% donation is not going to matter to their overall health. So let's use that $10,000 for this organization that has a $100,000 budget versus the $6 million budget organization over here. The other thing that we did was that I thought was kind of unique, and this was again sort of a suggestion from the Scarlet Foundation gentleman. He said, you don't want to get people dependent on your particular organization's gifts. And so we built in a 3-year rotation where all organizations were considered, when we gave to them, we pretty much said we're going to give to you 2 out of the 3 years, and we might give you all 3 years and then sort of renew. But on that 3rd year, the goal was, or the idea was, that we would tell them ahead of time, hey, on year 3, we're not going to give you a gift. And the reason for that was so that they would go out and find other funders so that they didn't rely on Westminster's gift alone as a majority of their budget. And at the same time, we said there are organizations, though, that we want to make core organizations that are either so dependent or so important to us that we don't want to have that gap year, that skip that we did. So that was our goal. I think we created a good process, and we've tried to document that really well, and the process and the scorecards and the application forms and all that, so that it can be used going forward and people can maintain it.
It's been a useful tool to feel like we properly evaluate the agencies that ultimately are the beneficiaries of the funding we supply. And it makes the committee members, I think, feel confident in our decisions, that the records are well kept. We can justify the decisions that we make on behalf of our church. It's worked very well.
Good. One thing I wanted to ask too was, you asked a question in the email to us beforehand to think about, and what was the amount of budgeting of our budget compared to the church's budget? Was that a tithe? Is there a discussion we can have about that, or do we know enough to? I know it's, the church budget is about $3.5 million. Our budget is somewhere in the $300,000 range. Is it
About
still
$385, and it has been
For years.
$385 for as long as I've been part
Same
of
here.
this discipline. And I don't expect it'll change next year anyway. Yeah, I don't know if it ended up at 10%-ish on purpose or it just worked out that way. I'm not sure.
It was, at one point, it was a little higher because we had the
Habitat
money
in there.
and also the money for the Presbyterian that we gave. They lumped that in, so it was about $500,000. But those are always sort of
Always
earmarked.
fixed,
And then at some point, we said, let's just take those out. We don't have any say-so in
Right.
it. They're just giving the money anyway, so, sounds good, but.
I feel like our budget is a healthy budget. It's a meaningful amount of money. It gives us the opportunity to offer true support to the agencies that request and need funding. I think we've been very generous in that way.
Yeah, I'd like to say too, that concept of not funding certain agencies every third or fourth year gives us some funds with which to possibly fund a new agency.
That's right.
So that gives us more flexibility. The challenge we've had with new agencies is having the time and people to go out and visit them and do the research on top of the other work of the Benevolence Committee. But at least that programming of the every third year a gap gives us some funds to do that with.
It's
very
good to
healthy.
have a little bit of flexibility in the budget to respond to emergency needs or unforeseen circumstances where people truly are in need of financial resources, and it's nice to be able to support that as best we can if we keep the budget flexible enough to do that. Dave, do you want to talk about how fortunate you were to be chairing the committee during the pandemic? And how things had to change.
Glad
Things had to talk about being flexible, right?
I'm David Thombs, and I'm a retired pediatrician. Been a member of Westminster for, I don't know, since KC was here, I think 15, 18 years. And I had the privilege of being on the committee with these two gentlemen, who I would consider my mentors. Certainly when this entire process was being developed, it was like being part of a new company. There were principles that were applied that you would do if you were a startup. And it was really good for me to see that. We incorporated everything that Scott and his colleagues, who were the developers of this process. And then Walker preceded me and helped me very much in getting started. But it was a surprise because I did do it for 2 years, and 20 and 21, but in 2019, late in that year, November and December, in Wuhan, China, a problem started, which was the COVID-19 epidemic. Our country didn't pay too much attention to it initially, but then it entered the country in the state of Washington, and it was just no time at all before it spread across the entire country. And we had to change what we were doing. People began wearing masks, washing their hands a lot more. Sometimes they even washed their entire groceries when they came home. And everybody began to settle into what's important and what isn't important. But what happened with the Benevolence Committee was that while we started out in my term being able to meet in person and doing like it was done before, we had to move to remote meetings using the app of Zoom, which I think in the pandemic, Zoom really was used a lot for meetings. So it was a little less personal, but the commitment of everyone was entirely the same. We were still able to go out and visit agencies. We were still able to employ the process that Scott had developed for us. But the meetings were interesting. I had my own little studio developed where at least I could go in and turn everything on and not have to upset the whole house. And my wife knew to shut a lot of doors and not have a noise coming in from somewhere else during the meetings. But I think we also had some disruption because the agencies themselves, many of them were not able to even function properly because their volunteers couldn't do it. They couldn't show up. So at that end, we were very sympathetic about that. Sometimes we even augmented their gift because they needed more money to have their processes work. We had a very interesting thing happen in 2020, and that was because of the government, not gift, but grant to businesses and institutions like Westminster Presbyterian. Westminster got a very substantial grant from the CARES Act, and that allowed our staff to be able to be paid, and it allowed them to continue to receive their benefits. So they still had health care if they had emergencies. They were taken care of by the CARES Act. The grant was so substantial, and Westminster was so solid going into that there was $450,000 left over from that. Now, the discussion of what to do with that was impressive. And what we found out was you could not give it back. You had to keep the $450,000. And so it was given to a ad hoc committee that was largely like the Benevolence Committee, but had other members in it too. People like Tom Wiley and other of our Westminster members who had great experience in the past with what we needed to do. So while we gave substantial gifts to the people that we always do, Westminster Home Connection, Martha O'Brien, and other agencies like that, we also considered agencies we'd never given to before, people who were in need. So we gave gifts to Hillwood High School. We gave gifts to Nueva Vista, which was an agency that I think popped up during the pandemic. Nueva Vista gave money to people in need, but they also gave them new views to other agencies that could provide for them too. So it was like a central clearinghouse. I think an agency that we gave to Frontera de Cristo was the agency down on the Arizona border where our church became very much involved with people who were using coffee growing to provide money for their employees and the people who lived in that region. And then we also got great coffee brought back here to Westminster for sale to our individuals. And Frontera de Cristo was I think something that taught us a lot about our involvement elsewhere. So the generosity of the church then began to look elsewhere, and particularly the following year, when the flood occurred down in Waverly, the abundance of giving from Westminster Church approached about $500,000, and so the additional funds that were utilized after giving out our usual gifts were largely given to Waverly at that time. So I think the church adapted well, and the Benevolence Committee adapted well to the COVID epidemic, and we gradually moved back to standard procedures.
And I would say that the committee is operating on a more normal basis now. Our meetings are hybrid. Some people still enjoy the Zoom option, which is great. But we're able to visit the agencies that we serve, and every committee member has the assignment to visit one or more agency, make one or more agency visits during the year and report back to the committee on the status of that organization. We're interested in knowing about their financial stability and how they're managed, if they're having a change in leadership, what challenges they might face, and ultimately how they would spend the funding that Westminster provides. So we've come out of the pandemic in good shape and back on a normal schedule, I would say. One thing that we have focused on this year, perhaps more so than in the past, and there have been many mentions in this conversation about volunteer efforts where Westminster members are looking for ways to volunteer in the community, and they want to offer their time to groups that need that. And one thing that we learn when we visit agencies are their needs for volunteers. So we're working to establish a more intentional and more formal relationship with the Hands-on Mission Committee. Their job is to match church members who want to volunteer with agencies that need volunteers. So when we learn about volunteer needs at an agency, we communicate those as quickly as we can to Hands-on Mission, and we each committee has a liaison that stays in touch with the other group, and so we're working to be more connected with Hands-on Mission than perhaps we have in the past, to understand what agencies we serve that are in common, and ultimately to work to find even further alignment. It just makes sense that the organizations that we support financially ought to be, to some extent, the same organizations we are supporting with volunteers. So we're working to strengthen that concept this year.
Yeah, I'd like to say that I think that affiliation with Hands-on Mission is really, really great. I did meet one time with another church on West End Avenue, I won't say who it is, and talked about their Benevolence Committee issues, and they basically just gave $1,000 to whatever agencies they supported. They didn't really spend a lot of time. If it was more of a reaction thing, we'll just, okay, here's $1,000. And we are involved with the agencies and try to understand what they do and how our members can participate in that mission. And I think it's
important to make the point that agencies are invited to request funding. So that's where it all starts.
Mm-hmm.
An agency will let us know how much they're asking for. And once we collect all of those requests, then we sit down as a group and assess that total dollar amount against our budget, and we do have one. And we have to make some choices sometimes. We can't always fulfill every request that comes to the extent that the request is made. Mm-hmm. So those are difficult conversations, but we have to be practical about these things too. So that's where a lot of the learnings from the process come into play.
And I'll say that during my time, I was really pleased to see that we tried to be really unbiased, that we tried not to have favorites and lean on the Benevolence Committee to give to my favorite or a couple of people's favorites. It really, people were really, they tried to take and look at the real needs and the health and why and the fit, instead of just, lobbying for my favorite agency and why I should do this.
I think everybody that gets involved with the Benevolence Committee is enlightened and educated and find it very heartwarming to know all of the things that go on in Nashville and beyond, and to know how fully committed Westminster is to supporting those efforts. It's been a great learning for me. I feel great about what our church is doing in the committee, and we're doing what we're asked to do, which is to shine the light of Christ everywhere we can.